Hello and happy Halloween, everybody. Spencer here with a very spooky Atlus video in many senses. So, if many of you know me, you know that I am a huge fan not only of Atlus video games, but also horror games especially. So, for this year, I wanted to do something kind of different. Along with this being my first actual Halloween-themed episode, I wanted to take a interesting dive back into the history not only of horror games for this year's Halloween, but for Atlus horror games. Now, if many of you are aware of, the PlayStation 5 is really close to coming out. Like, we are less than 2 weeks from the next generation being here. So this also works as an interesting look back not only at Atlus history, not only at horror history, but actually at one of the earliest PlayStation 4 horror games of all time. Now, as I've had this discussion with many people privately, I've found out that the game I am going to be talking about today is not very fondly remembered. If you do remember it, you probably don't have the highest reputation of it, but it's just such a weird kind of thing that holds an interesting place in my heart. I'm not even sure how really to describe it, but I wanted to talk to you guys all about it. So without further ado, for this Halloween 2020 weird video for the channel, I wanted to talk all about the game Daylight. Daylight is a first-person horror game that was developed by Zombie Studios, who are probably most famous for the Blacklight Retribution game, or as most people remember, that one free-to-play first-person shooter when the PS4 launched. Now, along with Zombie's history of games, Daylight stands out as a really interesting one, and for this channel especially, the Atlus connection comes in the form of Atlus was actually the primary publisher for Daylight. So what was so interesting about this was back on the time where I fondly remember Atlus as the will basically publish anything and everything that seems interesting to us. Like, if you're looking at Atlus as a company now, they're basically Sega. You look at their year, they've got Sakura Wars and 13 Sentinels as their kind of weird out there games, and then you have Catherine, Persona, and Yakuza. Nothing really that crazy or sort of out there. But back in the old days, especially when Atlus was USA as opposed to Atlus West, which they're called now, Atlus would publish all sorts of games. You would have stuff like Lost Dimensions, Rollers of the Realm, and R.I.P.D. the game. I mean, if you're an Atlus fan, everyone here knows about R.I.P.D. the game. Shout out to Ryan Reynolds for being #1 Atlus fan. So, Daylight was kind of just one of their things of, hey, we're publishing games that seem interesting or that need a publisher, so let's give it a shot. And what's so interesting about Daylight is not only its publisher being Atlus, not only it coming from a pretty small development team, just like various other factors, it was a super early Unreal Engine 4 game. Like, back in 2014 when this game released, there were not a ton of titles releasing on Unreal Engine 4. The engine was very new, people were still kind of getting used to it, and even if they weren't just getting used to it, everyone had been working with Unreal Engine 3 for so many months, if not years, in the previous generation that they weren't really sure what to do with the engine, and it was definitely sort of in untested waters, which is funny, especially if you go back and look at my last video, or if you jump ahead now 6 years after Daylight's release, Unreal Engine 4 is undoubtedly one of the most popular open source engine softwares out there. So, if you're not really aware, Daylight is a procedurally generated first-person horror game, and procedurally generated horror, along with procedurally generated just about anything, is always really hard to strike right. On top of that, if that wasn't weird enough, the game was primarily written by Jessica Chobot. Now, if you're not a super nerd who was around in the early days of the internet, give or take like 7 to 10 years ago, Jessica Chobot definitely got her reputation. Half of it was from hosting a lot of video game related events. The other half may or may not have come from her licking stuff like the PSP or the PlayStation Vita. But hey, who am I to judge? God knows I've licked a lot of weird things in my life. So, Jessica Chobot somehow gets picked to write this first-person procedurally generated horror game published by Atlus on the PlayStation 4 and PC. And at the time before its release, it was actually pretty anticipated. I remember there were not a lot of horror games out for the PlayStation 4 at the time. This was in that era of stuff like Slender or Amnesia, like being really, really big on PC, and there just wasn't anything out there like that on the console market. I remember for me, as someone who's always primarily played consoles, I was always so jealous of stuff like Slender or, I mean, God, I even remember before I had a way to play stuff like Five Nights at Freddy's, just like these things that were never really easily on consoles for the longest time, I sort of wish we could have, because even though horror has definitely had its ups and downs, console definitely sort of ending the PS3 generation and starting the PS4 generation, there wasn't really that sort of even distribution of where it went. It was, for a long time, primarily a lot of niche stuff was going to PC. I think that's actually one of the biggest things something like Daylight had going for it. Even though it was using a new engine, it was far from being a very graphically impressive game, but it's also important to know for context, this was a game that was being sold, its MSRP was $15, it had a launch discount, and even if you were on PlayStation Plus, it was like under $10. So it was a pretty cheap experience. It was trying a lot of stuff new. It even had features that were really big in the early PS4 generation that just basically got dropped like a dead horse later on. It had one of those features where if you were streaming it natively through your PlayStation 4, you'd actually be able to, in the Twitch chat, say certain keywords or phrases that would trigger jump scares. Now, obviously, those jump scares are going to happen naturally through the AI planning stuff, but if you're like me and actually were live streaming yourself playing this game, you could just have people spam jump scare, jump scare, jump scare, jump scare. Which, obviously, your mileage is going to vary for how scary you actually find this game to be. I found upon going back to it recently for this video that it definitely left a lot to be desired in terms of scares. Mostly like the mysterious, creepy ghost lady who's always hunting you. She can sometimes work in terms of giving you jump scares, but the random inanimate objects moving, falling over, or just kind of sliding across the floor, it was always a, oh hey, look at that chair moving. Yep, that chair definitely moved over on its own. In terms of like positives though for what the horror had going for it, I thought it was really interesting that it actually reminded me a little bit of kind of a mixture between Slender and Layers of Fear. Mostly the Layers of Fear comparison comes from the moments where the game would kind of shift your location on the map just for different scares, and stuff like that was very sort of rare to see at the time, and it's very sporadic through the game, but when it happens, it's usually done pretty well. Now, if you're wondering how a game like this works in terms of its procedural generation, it's mostly through the maps, and what's really kind of sad is once you sort of realize the loop of this game, it kind of loses all of its terror. Basically, your entire playthrough for you is go into a new area, run through tons of rooms, look for a certain number of clues, find the key, go to the door, rinse and repeat that less than a handful of times, and then you roll credits. And the procedural generation comes from the maps where you're looking for all of these clues, but at a certain point when you're running throughout your umpteenth corridor, whether it be in a insane asylum, a hospital, a sewer, it just never left any sort of memorable impression even after my third playthrough this year. So, oddly enough, this game actually is now delisted on the PlayStation Network. You can still buy it on Steam, as Zombie, I think, is now just the straight-up publisher for it there. And Atlus seems to have just either let the rights lapse in giving it back to Zombie, and Zombie just hasn't really viewed it as worth it to self-publish it themselves. But it's kind of been lost to history in terms of console. It's definitely not going to be a PT where people are going to look back on it years and years ago and go, oh my gosh, did you hear that horror game Jessica Chobot wrote? That was amazing. It's just kind of one of those things of like, hey, it's a interesting horror game very early from the PlayStation 4 generation, and most likely due to it being a digital-only release, I doubt a lot of people are going to remember it. My biggest hope is that hopefully someone watching this video might be inspired to, if not check it out on PC, find a way to just look up a little bit of research, or just think, hey, I learned about a new horror game this year. Either way, guys, I just wanted to kind of take this opportunity to talk about one of the weirder pieces of Atlus history. I know it has nothing to do with Shin Megami Tensei or Persona, but I hope you guys enjoyed hearing me ramble about one of Atlus's biggest horror games on the PlayStation 4, and most importantly, Atlus's first game on the PlayStation 4. Now, obviously, this is just Atlus as a publisher, not Atlus as the developer. But either way, if you guys enjoyed listening to this spooktacular Halloween episode of Atlus history and trivia, please let me know down in the comments below. And if you have actually played Daylight, please also let me know, because I've talked to a lot of people about this, and I think I'm still less than like 5 people who actually own this game who didn't work on it. Either way, guys, like I said, if you enjoyed this video, please consider commenting or subscribing to the channel. It really, really helps. I hope everyone out there has a great Halloween. Thank you so much once again for watching this video, and I will see you later. Bye.